The Treasury Department just released the new I-bond rates that are effective today, November 1st. So in this video, we're going to take a look at the new rates and how they're calculated. Then we're going to compare them to alternatives, primarily TIPS. And then finally, we're going to talk about what we should do. Should we buy, sell, or hold? I'll share with you what I'm doing and why. So let's dive right into it and start with the new rate. The new composite rate, as you can see here, is 5.27%. Now remember, the composite rate is comprised of a fixed rate that never changes for the life of the 30-year bond and an inflation-adjusted rate that changes every 6 months, November and May. So you can see, maybe, it's a little bit small here, but you can see the fixed rate is 1.3%. Now that's a significant part of the composite rate, again, because it stays set for the life of the 30-year bond. It was 0.9% the previous 6 months, so it's gone up 40 basis points. So you'll get effectively an after-inflation rate of 1.3% for the life of the bond. Really, really important. Now that's, again, just part of the rate. The other part is the inflation adjustment. We can think of that as just the difference, 527 minus 1.3%. There's actually some math involved in how they calculate it. For those that want to dive into the numbers, there you go. What they look at is the semi-annual inflation rate, which is 1.97%. They do a bunch of math. There's some rounding and so forth and so on, and it takes us from the fixed rate of 1.3 to 5.27%. So if you buy a bond, an I-bond, between now and next April, it doesn't matter when during that time you buy it, your fixed rate will be 1.3% for the life of the bond, and you'll get the composite rate of 5.27% for a full 6 months. And this is something that's important to understand about I-bonds. They set the rate in effective November 1 and May 1, but if you buy your I-bonds at different months, you'll still get the full benefit of whatever the current composite rate is for 6 months, which means when your particular I-bond rate changes depends on the month that you bought it. But either way, it doesn't matter when you buy it, you're going to get the composite rate, whatever it is, each 6 months for a full 6 months. And then, of course, it changes. So although they set a new rate in November and May, when the rate on your I-bond will change will depend on the month in which you bought it. Now, the inflation rate can seem like a little bit of a mystery. Let me just show you briefly how they calculate it. They use the consumer price index for urban folks, city folks, and it's not seasonally adjusted. So I'll leave a link to this below the video for those that are interested. But for the current rate, they basically took this number, this was the September CPI-U number, subtracted March and what that delta was, and then just took what that percentage is from the 301 number. And you get, I think it's about 1.97. Is that what it was? Yeah, 1.97. And they do some math, as you can see, and that gets us to an inflation number that's roughly 4%, 3.97%. Then you add the fixed rate, and that gets you to 5.27%. So that's sort of the mechanics behind it. And again, that rate will last for 6 months. So is that a good rate or not? You know, how should we think about this, and how should we compare it to other investments? For me, the most logical comparison of an I-bond would be with TIPS. They both protect us against inflation. They're both inflation adjusted, right? But the way they do it is different. So just as a refresher, with I-bonds, as we just saw, they protect us against inflation by that inflation rate. And it gets adjusted every 6 months. It's backward looking, so it looks at the last 6 months. But that's fine. You're going to get that inflation adjustment every 6 months. It will change, but whatever inflation happens to have been, you'll get that a rate based on that CPI-U number. So we can think of an I-bond as simply a bond that has a real yield, that is after inflation, of 1.3%. TIPS do it differently. With TIPS, the coupon rate, that is the interest rate, never changes. Instead, they protect us against inflation by changing the face value of the bond. So imagine you buy $1,000 of TIPS. If there's inflation, that $1,000 is going to get increased by the rate of inflation. And when the government then goes to calculate your interest payments, they'll take that coupon rate, which never changes, and multiply it against the new, presumably higher a par value of the bond, assuming we have inflation. The difference is tips can actually go down. If there's deflation, probably not something most of us are worried about right now, but let's imagine prices go down. With tips, the par value of that bond will go down and coupon rate will get applied to that lower value. Now, the good news is if you hold the bond to maturity, you'll at a minimum get the par value, let's say $1,000 in our example, you'll get that. Even if we had falling prices for the next 30 years, you'd eventually get that $1,000 back. But until then, your interest rate would be multiplied against that smaller and smaller amount. Now, again, I think for most folks, they're not losing much sleep over the risk of deflation, but it is a difference because with I bonds, you're always going to get that 1.3% fixed rate, and the par value of your bond isn't going to go down. It's you're going to get if you invested $10,000, you're going to get that 1.3% at a minimum, and the value of the bond's going to slowly go up. So there is a difference in a way you could think of an I bond as protecting us somewhat against deflation. Again, probably not the most significant risk on the horizon, but it is a difference. Now, there are many other differences. We'll talk about a few of them as we go, but the thing to look at in comparing the two is the TIPS real yield. So let's take a look at that. So we're looking at the Treasury Department. This is the TIPS real yield. There's 5 years up to 30. For now, let's compare it to the 30, and the latest we have is from yesterday. So this has a real yield after inflation of 2.51%. Obviously, that's significantly higher than the fixed rate on I bonds of 1.3%. So what does that mean for us? Well, if I were going to buy a 30-year bond and I plan to hold it to maturity, there is absolutely no question I would buy a 30-year TIPS because its real yield is significantly higher than an I bond. So for long-term investors, I think the answer is TIPS. Now, there are nuances to all of this. For example, the tax treatment of TIPS is different than I bonds. With an I bond, you can defer the taxes until you sell the bond. With TIPS, assuming it's in a taxable account, you're going to have to pay taxes every year, including on the inflation adjustment, even though in our hypothetical, a 30-year TIPS bond, you're not going to actually get the benefit of that inflation adjustment, at least in the form of getting your money back, for 30 years. Of course, that's one of the reasons why I would never own TIPS in a taxable account. Never, ever. So if I'm going to buy TIPS, I'd buy it in a retirement account. But if that's not an option for you, if I had to buy it in a taxable account, I might do the math to see how I thought each one might work out, but I'd probably lean more towards I bonds because of the tax treatment. But again, that's not a limitation for me. So as a long-term investor, to me, it's a no-brainer. TIPS absolutely are better than I bonds. So then the question becomes, well, what about shorter term investments? So for example, with an I bond, you have to hold it for a year. You can't sell it for the first 12 months. If you sell it before year 5, you pay a penalty of 3 months interest. So that leaves the question, well, what if we want to invest for 5 years? Which way should we go? Well, we can look at that. Well, again, we know the real yield on the I bond for 5 years. It's going to be that 1.3% fixed rate. But with TIPS, again, 2.42 is the real yield on the 5-year as of yesterday. So again, if I knew that I needed money, say 5 years from now, I'd be buying a TIPS over an I bond. So again, to me, TIPS win. Now, remember, this wasn't always the case. I mean, it wasn't that long ago when the real yield on TIPS was negative. But obviously, things have changed a lot over the last couple of years. And so for me, TIPS are just a much, much better buy. Now, you recall when the inflation rate on TIPS was over 9%, boy, wasn't that nice. There was a lot of talk, and I even did this, buy an I bond. Even if you want to sell it after a year, yeah, you may take that, or you will take that 3-month interest rate hit if you sell it before 5 years, but the rate is so high it would still work out to be a pretty good deal. Is that true today? I think the answer is no, and let me show you why. Again, we've got the 1.3% fixed rate, right, on I bonds. But if we're thinking as a short-term investor, we could say, well, we'll get 5.27% for the first 6 months. That's not bad. We don't know what the next 6 months will be. But what we could do, one way to play this would be to say, well, you know what we'll do? We'll wait until we get into April of 2023. And we'll have a good idea then. We'll know what the inflation rate is going to be for the I bonds starting May 1. So if it still looks attractive, we could buy the I bond in, say, April of 2020, I guess it'd be 2024. That would give us 6 months at this 5.27%. We might not know the fixed rate that would go into effect May 1, but we'd at least know the inflation rate. And if assuming it's at a rate that we think is attractive, that might get us a full year of pretty decent rates, and then we could sell after a year and take the 3-month interest haircut. The problem is, while that worked when I bonds were 7 to 9%, here at 5.27%, I just don't think the math works out. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is, if we go to just a nominal Treasury bond and we look at the 1-year T-bill, we're getting actually a higher rate of 5.44%. Like I bonds, the Treasury T-bills, you don't pay state and local income tax, and you're getting a higher yield. So to me, just a 1-year T-bill would be more attractive than trying to take some short-term strategy with I bonds. And I'd also add, even frankly, just a regular old CD. And one that I find attractive is this 16-month no penalty CD. You've got to hold it, I think, for 30 days, but after that you can sell anytime you want. And it's at 5.4%. Now, yes, you'd pay state income tax on that, but I think you'd end up better off if you compare that to selling an I bond after a year and having to pay or lose 3 months worth of interest. So given the current rate environment, I just don't see I bonds as an attractive investment at all. So what am I doing? Well, one, I'm not buying any new I bonds at this point. I just don't think the rates justify it. And in fact, I'll probably be selling the I bonds that we have. Now, I'd already sold one I bond that I bought more than 5 years ago. It had a fixed rate of 0%. There was just no reason to keep it. With the I bonds that my wife and I now own, they also are at 0%, but they're within the 5-year period. So we're going to lose 3 months worth of interest. But to me, it's worth it given the rates that we can get elsewhere. So right now, we're effectively only earning the inflation rate on those older I bonds. And for me, I'd rather just take the 3-month loss in interest and put that money in higher yielding fixed income investments like TIPS. Now, I suppose there could be a situation where even at a 0% fixed rate, you might hold on to an I bond. One idea I have there is if you're planning to use it for qualified education expenses where you get the tax break, you just have to make sure you qualify. At one point I thought, should we hold on to them for our granddaughter? But in order to qualify, one of the requirements is that your loved one is a dependent. And our granddaughter is not our dependent. And so we wouldn't qualify for that. There are also other limitations, so you want to make sure you qualify for it. But I suppose if you had a child going to college in a year or two, it might be worth holding on to it and using it for educational purposes, again, assuming you qualify for it. But short of that, I just don't see any reason to hold on to 0% I bonds where all you're getting is the inflation rate. It's come down significantly, and you've got Treasury bills that I think are very attractive right now, and you have TIPS with real yields around 2.5%, which to me are just much, much better than I bonds. So that's my take on it. There you go. That's the new I bond rate and how it's calculated, how it compares to TIPS, and where I'm standing in terms of I bonds and my approach to them. I'm going to probably be selling the few that we have. Again, part of that analysis also is in what year do I want to incur that interest income. In our case, it's not a lot of money, so it probably doesn't matter. But as always, you want to consider the tax consequences whenever you sell an investment in a taxable account. Well, there you go. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. Be happy to help you out any way I can. Also, I send out a newsletter every Sunday morning. It's free, and you can check that out with the link below this video. So until next time, remember, the best thing money can buy is financial freedom.